on question types and relationships. GED Live, as always, is brought to you by the GED Testing Service and Kaplan Test Prep. And I am Kaplan teacher Rachel. And what we're going to do today is look at how relationships in passages and in graphics that you deal with on the GED Social Studies test will help you to understand how to research and how to answer the questions. Right? And so no matter what your passage is about, there are a couple things that you're always going to have to do on the GED Social Studies test. And that is reflected in our learning objectives here for this session. You have to be able to figure out what kind of inferences you can make. Now notice that it says here, not just any old inferences, but logical inferences, and logical inferences that are based on the claims and details within the text. Okay, so that's really important. Right? Every inference that you make on the GED Social Studies test has to come from something that was actually in the text. We're also going to use the text and the context of it, right? Especially historical context, to make interpretations, right? So basically, you are interpreting the passages. Sometimes, it's an entire passage that you're interpreting. Sometimes it could be a phrase. Sometimes it could come down to even one single word. You're using the context of the passage, figuring out what it's talking about, so that you can figure out what that particular piece of the passage means. Okay, so that's going to be our focus for today. But before we get started actually diving into the material, it's helpful to understand how the test maker comes up with these passages and questions in the first place, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at that. The GED Social Studies test has what we call focusing themes. And the focusing themes are simply sort of structural areas of topics, right? I mean, not even structural, but areas of topics that the test maker uses to see how good you are at these things here, at analyzing, evaluating, making inferences. Okay, now, so within these themes, right, you'll be tested on high school level social studies material. But always keep in mind that those facts and the material that would be covered in high school social studies is really just a way for the test maker, again, to figure out how good you are at analyzing, at evaluating, and at making inferences. And so you will see questions that come broadly from two areas, right? Two different themes: development of modern liberty and democracy, and dynamic responses in societal systems. And they sound very kind of highfalutin, possibly even scary, but I promise you they're not. Let's just take a look at some of the examples of the types of things that you might see on the test within these themes. Right? So development of modern liberties and democracy actually is pretty much what it sounds like. You're going to be looking at different types and structures of governments, and what kind of principles underlie them, and for instance, the principle of democracy, right, which would underlie a representative democracy such as the one that we have here in the United States, right? Specific events in U.S. history. Now, there are a few events that you need to have some general knowledge about, but you don't need to memorize a lot for the social studies, for the GED Social Studies test. We want you to always remember that it's so much more about taking the material that you're given and working with it than it is about remembering a lot of facts and being able to regurgitate them on demand. Also, classical civilizations, such as Greeks, Romans, Mayans, ancient Arabic civilizations, ancient Chinese civilizations, any of those classical civilizations could be up for grabs in terms of a topic on the social studies test. Now, this other theme, dynamic responses in societal systems, well, again, it sounds a little fancy, but dynamic responses. Okay, well, how societies change, right? How responses is, when something is a response, it happens because of something. It comes out of something, right? So changes in the environment, changes in relationships between and among countries, they can have a tremendous effect on what happens in history, right? And so we're looking at, it says here, human systems, structures, and policies. Well, that would be things like actual politics and elections, stuff that's very current to our everyday experience, what we hear about in the news, the elections that we vote in, right? Could be something like that, quite familiar. Basic economics can be tested on the GED social studies test. Domestic and foreign policies of the United States, and just anything to do with, countries, borders, relationships between countries. But again, you're going to be given passages, you're going to read the passages, you're going to extract the important information from the passages, and then based on that, not based on what's in your memory, you're going to answer questions. So let's take a look at how the GED Social Studies test is likely to ask you questions. So if you think back to those, what they call social studies practices or skills that you need to be able to have, you're looking at what we call evaluation, analysis, and inference, right? So 3 different skills, related skills, but you can make a distinction between them. And so we can take a look at the types of questions that reward those skills. So for instance, in the area of evaluation, right, you might be looking for the topic or main idea of a passage, or for the author's purpose or point of view. You could also be asked to recognize whether a statement is biased or opinionated, or whether it's completely neutral. And if you haven't already attended or watched the Points of View social studies session, you'll learn more and practice more with that in that session. Analysis could involve figuring out what kind of principle or assumption is underlying a statement or a passage. Thinking about how an author came to develop a certain point of view. What is the background of the author, and how might that inform the author's point of view? And again, more on that in the session that involves points of view. And when it comes to questions involving graphics, you're going to have to extract information and sometimes put pieces of information together to answer questions about some of those graphics, charts, graphs, or anything else that's visual in the test. It was going to involve some analysis. And then there are inferences, which again are taking the information that's in the passage and figuring out what you can say based on that. And a lot of times a really important skill in inference, and the GED Social Studies test does ask you to make a lot of inferences. It's quite common. And so what it says here is that you need to be able to identify an accurate paraphrase. So paraphrase is just another way of saying something. And you need to be careful about that, right? Because when you choose a correct answer, it's often going to be the same thing that the passage said, but just in different words. And what the test maker can do is have an answer choice that uses some of the same words that were in the passage, but doesn't actually give you the right idea. And so that's important to pay attention to, and to know that paraphrasing, putting things into other words and recognizing other words, other ways of saying the same thing, is really important. So let's go ahead and just take a look at a couple of other ways you might make inferences on this test. Recognizing an example, right? An example of something that was described in the passage is a way of making an inference, and we'll take a look at that later in the session. And determining how a particular word is used in context is a way of making an inference. And so just to give you a sense of how some of these things actually play out, I have a little mini example here. We're going to go right into an in-format example right after this, but just to give you a little bit of kind of food for thought to get us going here, let's take a look at this little mini passage. Okay. Let me get this formatted on screen for you so that you can read here about Julius Caesar. So here we have a little passage about Julius Caesar. And so it says, born in 100 BC, Julius Caesar was a key figure in the rise of the Roman Empire. The transformation of the Roman Republic would not have been possible without his brilliant military insight and strategy. So you've probably heard of Julius Caesar, and you probably have some notions, some ideas connected with him, but there's nothing that we can say on the GED Social Studies test that isn't based on what's right here in this passage. So for instance, if we were asked, based on this, again, really mini passage here, what the author's purpose was, well, we're being introduced to Julius Caesar, given some important facts about Julius Caesar, and we're told that he had brilliant military insight and strategy, right? So the author's purpose here would be to discuss some of the historical importance and characteristics of Julius Caesar, right? So, purpose. What is the author actually trying to do? That's one of the types of questions that you might be asked. Now, I want to draw your attention to this one, identifying a principle or assumption that a passage is based on. Because an assumption is something that the author must believe is true if that author is writing whatever it is in this passage. So I want you to take a look at this phrase right here. The transformation of the Roman Empire would not have been possible without his brilliant military insight and strategy, right? Now, if the author says this transformation wouldn't have been possible without that particular quality of military insight, then the author must believe that in order to transform a republic, you need to have military insight and strategy, right? So in that way, the author doesn't actually come out and say, well, in order to be able to do this, you would have to have that. Just says he couldn't have done it without that. And so that's how you know that that's something that the author considers necessary for the transformation of a republic. Now, what you'll notice here, and this is the kind of thing you really want to pay attention to in these passages, is something like the following. If you note that here, the passage refers to the Roman Empire, and then here it refers to the Roman Republic, right? That is not a typo, right? That's not just somebody making a mistake. Oh, empire, republic, they're the same thing. They're not. Right? And this would be a great example of how you just want to have that basic knowledge that an empire is kind of ruled by an emperor, whereas a republic is a system of government where you have some kind of representation, some kind of group of people that makes decisions, makes laws, based at least in some part on what the people want to do, right? So an empire and a republic are two different things, right? So you recognize in this passage that it says Julius Caesar was a key figure in the rise of the Roman Empire. And then it says the transformation of the Roman Republic wouldn't have been possible without his military brilliance, right? So that must mean, and here we're in the land of inferences, that must mean that there was a Roman Republic and Julius Caesar helped to change it into the Roman Empire, right? And that's a classic example of the kinds of inferences that you can make. So notice here an inference is an implication, right? So we have this implication that there was a Roman Republic that then became an empire, and Julius Caesar was a big part of that. So let's say, for instance, something you could infer from this passage was that in the year 100 BC, and let's actually go ahead and highlight that. In the year 100 BC, notice we're able to use a fact like that from the passage. In the year 100 BC, there was a republic. There was a Roman Republic. The Roman Empire had not started yet. because Julius Caesar was just being born, and he was a big part of bringing that empire about. So that's an idea of some of the inferences that you can make, how you can think about what assumptions an author is making, and how to kind of home in on what the author's purpose is. Now let's go ahead and dive into some in-format work. So to do that, we're going to take a look at this passage here about Greek theater. So take a minute, pause the video, and go ahead and read this paragraph. This is just a one paragraph passage. So everything you have to read is right here on screen right now. And then come back when you're ready with your summary of what this paragraph is about. Welcome back. So when you read this passage, immediately you saw that theater was one of the most popular forms of art in ancient Greece. But then immediately the passage goes on to get more specific than that. Right? One form of drama, the tragedy, was central to Greek culture. Then the next sentence begins with tragedies, okay, telling us something about these Greek tragedies. And so what you'll notice that even though we start talking about theater in ancient Greece, this passage quickly narrows it down to tragedies in particular. Right? And then, again, goes on to tell us some details about those tragedies. Now, we know that it's central. This type of drama, tragedy, is central to Greek culture. It's really important. Okay? So that's one of the big takeaways from this passage. Tragedy, very important to the Greeks. And then several facts about it. And so those facts are there. You don't necessarily need to take notes on each of those facts because you're always going to be able to research back to the passage when you answer the questions. So let's take a look at this question here. Which of the following is the topic of the paragraph? Okay, what is the paragraph about? Well, again, it's really important here. And we want you to think about this and about how the passage always gives you clues, and the test maker gives you clues in particular ways as to what the answer is going to be. And so you have a big clue right up in the beginning of this passage that this is about tragedy. Now, if you look at tragedies, that form of drama in particular, and if you look at your answer choices here, you're going to notice something. Right? The A and B talk about Greek theater and Greek drama. But this passage was much more focused than that. This passage was specifically about tragedies. And so drama and theater are not specific enough. And you can just go ahead and get rid of those answer choices right off the bat. Answer choice elimination, the elimination of incorrect choices, because they either say something wrong or leave out something essential, is a big part of your GED social studies strategy. And so now we've got two choices left. One says that this passage is about the characteristics of Greek tragedy. Excuse me. And the other says that it's about the most popular Greek tragedies. So you can decide two ways on this. You can look at this passage and say, it actually told me, right? It's about tragedy, and it told me, what they centered on. It told me that they're based on familiar stories. It told me specifically about this flaw. So what it's doing is describing the characteristics of the tragedy. And if you're tempted by answer choice D, it's very useful to think about why a wrong answer is wrong. That's going to be one of the best forms of study that you do when you're preparing for this test. And so the reason why you can look at answer choice D and say, well, that's wrong, is that the most popular Greek tragedies, well, that would actually have to name certain tragedies, or it would have to actually make a reference to which ones were most popular. And if you're saying to yourself, well, it did talk about the tragedies being popular, be very careful. Because this is a classic example of how a wrong answer can include some language or a word or a phrase from the passage, but that doesn't make it right. Because what the passage said is that theater was one of the most popular forms of art. Now that's before we even start talking about tragedies. But that's the only time that the passage talks about popularity, right? And so while the word popular comes up in the first sentence, the passage does not go on to tell us about the most popular Greek tragedies. It just tells us about Greek tragedy in general. And that means that answer choice D is out. If you were going solely by elimination, you can still get to answer choice C. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to the next question. And again, I will invite you to pause the video. And of course, you can pause the video anytime you like to rewind and go over something again, or just to stop and think, or whatever you need. But I will invite you to stop the video here, think through what kind of inference you could make based on the passage, right? So again, this is one of those classic inference questions. What could you say would have to be true based only on the information in the passage? It's got to be an accurate match. So give this a try and then come on back. Now, sometimes when you have an inference question, there will be some clue in what we call the question stem. This is the question stem, where they actually ask the question, and sometimes there will be a clue that's going to tell you where to do some research in the passage or what kind of research to do. But this one doesn't. It's very, very general. And so it's really hard to tell what kind of inference you might be able to make. So guess what? Just go straight to the answer choices. Right? As much as possible, you want to have a good idea of what you're looking for in the answer choices. But here we're not given enough material to work with to be able to really do that. So let's go choice by choice. Answer choice A says, ancient Greeks did not expect to see an original story each time they attended the theater. And so if you're like me, even a little bit, you may read this and say to yourself, I didn't read anything about what ancient Greeks expected. Right? And you'd be right about that. The passage does not state anything about what the Greeks expected, but that doesn't mean that you can't infer something about what they would have expected. So let's see what we know about Greek theater. Now, first of all, they just tell us it's one of the most popular forms of art. We're not getting any useful information there. But then we learn that tragedies told familiar stories from Greek myths and epics. And this was very much of a storytelling culture. So if people are familiar with these stories, and maybe they've been hearing them since they're 5 years old, right? And then they go to the theater and they see that story being acted out on stage, well then they're not expecting, right? They would not be expecting to be surprised by something brand new. Right? If their plays are just telling stories they've known for years, then they absolutely would not be expecting an original story. So, boom, you're done. Here's the thing though. There's a good chance that as you practice for the GED Social Studies test, you can see a correct answer and say, that looks pretty good, and not yet have the confidence to say, oh, it's definitely right. I'm not even going to look at the other choices. And we understand that. So if you see a choice that you can research and find that it's actually a very good match, then what that allows you to do is just read more quickly through the remaining choices and say, okay, can I see a reason why B is incorrect? Can I see a reason why C is incorrect? Can I see a reason why D is incorrect? So let's just take a look at that right here. B says playwrights in ancient Greece also wrote myths and epics. So again, this is a tricky distortion because in the passage, it actually says that the tragedies told familiar stories from myths and epics, but we don't know anything about what the playwrights wrote beyond the fact that they wrote the plays, because that's what playwrights do. Right? So this is a distortion. Yes. yes, myths and epics mentioned in the passage, but we do not have enough information to know whether the playwrights who were writing the plays based on the myths and epics also wrote myths and epics. We don't know that. So we can eliminate answer choice B. Right? And again, the phrase that takes this out, it's really good to be able to pick on a particular word or phrase. Also wrote myths and epics? No, we don't know that. Answer choice C. Tragedies in ancient Greece were judged on the basis of how serious their stories were. So again, the idea of something being serious, does that come up? Sure it does. They were serious dramas. But the idea of judgment, does that come up? Anywhere in this passage does it talk about how people decided what was a better tragedy and what was a worse tragedy? I think not. Right? That's not here anywhere in the passage. So this idea of judgment, not in the passage, can't make an inference. Say goodbye to that answer choice. And then D, only highly cultured people attended tragedies in ancient Greece. And this to me is an interesting kind of answer choice because you may find it's not uncommon at all for a test taker to read a passage and to have some kind of association with it. And when I think of the theater, I think of something that, is expensive. The tickets cost a lot. You got to get a little dressed up. Probably there's going to be a lot of wealthy people there, right? And so it does seem like one of those sort of, oh, well, that's for the elite or something like that. And so you may have that association with it. But what's always really, really important to pay attention to is whether something's just coming out of your own head, right? We've all got a lot of stuff going on in our heads. You want to make sure that what you're thinking about in the context of this question isn't something that comes from inside your head, but that comes from the passage. And so when you read the passage and it says, theater was one of the most popular forms of art in ancient Greece, and that it was central to Greek culture, that is an idea that's inconsistent with the notion that this was something, only for the wealthy, right? It was popular and it was central to Greek culture. So that's really inconsistent with the idea of it being something that was only for the highly cultured people in this society. And so, okay, say goodbye to answer choice D. And again, you do not have to necessarily go through this whole process for every question. You will approach each question in the way that is the most efficient for you. But when you do eliminate answer choices, you want to make sure that you have a strong basis for your elimination and that you're just not eliminating it, or you're not eliminating it just because you don't like the sound of it. Okay? And research is important. So, good. Let's go ahead and take a look at some other important concepts having to do with relationships on the GED Social Studies test. So, the idea of central claims and supporting details. Now, a central claim is kind of the main point, the big takeaway from a passage. And it's good to note that central claims are often directly stated. Sometimes authors beat around the bush a little bit, but very often they'll actually say, here's what I believe, but usually not using the first person. It's not so common for GED authors to say I. Of course, if a speech is being quoted, you may hear the speaker referring to him or herself in the first person, but often not even then. But look to the introduction, right, the beginning of the passage, and the conclusion, the end of the passage, for important ideas to be introduced or reinforced. Okay? And so again, your big takeaway question is, well, what is the author really, what's the point? What's the author trying to get across here? That's going to be your central claim. And then the author has to include some kind of support, right? So, all right, author, if this is what you think that I should believe, what details do you have to back it up, right? So you've got your supporting details that are given in to back up the central claim. And every passage basically has to be structured this way because no author on the GED test, whether it's from a primary source, who may be a speech that somebody gave back in history, or whether it's just a passage that is written about that, maybe a secondary source written about something that happened in history, and more about sources in the sources and points of view session. Regardless of what that source is, an author's never going to make a claim and then not back it up. Right? And so you're just looking for that relationship between what is the claim, how does the author support it? And again, based on the claims and the support that the author provides, you can make inferences, right? And we've already made a couple of inferences in this session. And so again, they are based on evidence, right? So they're based on what's in the passage, but not necessarily something that's stated in the passage, right? There's going to have to be support. And you may sometimes have to put together more than one statement in order to come up with the inference that is in the correct answer. So when you are looking to make inferences, and again, this is to some extent reinforcing what we've already talked about, is if the question stem does have clues, definitely use them to do your research and to find support for whatever the correct answer might be. If it doesn't, though, you're going to have to go choice by choice, as we did just a few minutes ago. Now, again, it's important to keep in mind what you are not going to see in an inference on the GED Social Studies test. And that is something that is just beyond what the passage talked about, or that potentially even contradicts the passage, right? Obviously can't be right. And again, something can't be right if the passage didn't even make any kind of reference or hint towards it. Right? In the case of, say, judgment in the passage that we were just looking at with Greek theater. Also, you want to be on the lookout for answer choices that have extreme wording. Words like always or never or must usually are too strong to be true based on what we know from the passage, because the passages are usually fairly neutral, and so it can be difficult to make a very extreme inference based on neutral information in the passage. And again, an inference has nothing to do with your opinion. You could make an inference based on the author's opinion if the author makes his or her opinion known in the passage, but your own opinion never matters at all, even a little bit. You have to make sure that you keep that out of it. Okay? And sometimes that's hard to do. Some passages you might really relate to and have an opinion about. Stay neutral. You're focused just on what the passage is telling you. So, taking some of that into account, again, let's give you some time. You take the time that you need to read this first part of this passage. Now, this is a passage that is going to go on to a second screen. So take a little time to read here, pause, come back when you're ready. We'll do a quick summary of this part of the passage, and then we'll go on to finish it up. So, in this passage, you can see that we've got some chronology going on. In other words, time is passing and different events are occurring as time passes. So we start in 1979, and we know that then Congress was allowing political parties to raise unlimited amounts of general purpose money, right? So they could raise as much money as they wanted. And so we get a description of the kind of money, right? General purpose money, not designated for particular candidates, okay? Then something else happened in 1991. So 10, 11, 12 years later, there was a lawsuit that forced disclosure of such soft money. Okay, so now they've given us a name for these donations, right? This money raising. General purpose money not designated for particular candidates. Okay, that's what we call soft money. And again, this is something you may have heard about on the news. So there was a lawsuit, and that forced disclosure. In other words, you had to make it public. Right? if you received such a donation, it had to be public so people could, understand what kind of money was changing hands, what each party was getting, and how the money was being spent. Okay, fine. So that's number 2. First, Congress allows these contributions. Second, then there's a lawsuit saying, okay, but we have to be able to know, how much money it is, where it's coming from, where it's going. All right, what's the third thing here? During the presidential elections of 1996 and 2000, okay, 2 elections, 96 and 2000, campaign fundraising, especially the raising and spending of soft money, was an issue, with the candidates promising reform. Okay, so here's kind of a story about soft money. It was allowed, but you didn't have to tell anyone about it. Then you had to tell people about it. Then it became an issue, and the candidates were like, oh yes, we're going to reform that. We'll take care of it. Right? Okay, this is our story so far. So it's just the history, and you may want to jot down little notes about what was happening each step along the way, but as long as you know that those 3 steps are here in the passage, you know you can always come back to it. So that's up to you. You want to take care not to write too many notes, but it's okay to jot down a few notes if it helps you to focus and keep track of what's in the passage. Now, again, at the end of the page here, we hear about this reform, right, around the turn of the millennium. All right, so let's see what else. Finally, in 2001, after several years of hearings, take a look at what happened. In 2001, a bill was passed that eliminated the unregulated soft money. Okay, so, right, we kind of have the rise and fall of soft money contributions, and that's what this passage is about. Right? Kind of a little brief history of soft money and how it came to be and how it came to go away. So, based on this, let's see what question or questions we have to answer. Question number 3. Which of the following is an example of a soft money contribution, right? So this is something that we saw on our question types chart earlier on. You have to infer, right? You have to figure out, based solely on what you read in the passage, one of these is a valid example of soft money and the other 3 aren't. So again, pause the video. Give yourself an opportunity to do some research, think about what it means for something to be soft money. What is the definition? And only one choice is consistent with that definition. So unpause and come on back when you're ready and we'll discuss. So in the very first sentence of this passage, we were given a nice definition. And what's interesting about this and something to be aware of is that the definition for soft money came before they ever called it soft money, right? And you can tell that by the structure of the text. Here's the definition: unlimited amounts of general purpose money not designated for particular candidates. And then it's not until the next sentence that it says a lawsuit forced disclosure of such soft money, such meaning what we were just referring to, right? So that's one of those kind of relational words that you'll sometimes see in these passages. It's really good to pay attention to. So soft money is what they just were referring to. So it is general purpose and not designated for a particular candidate. Well, which choice doesn't mention a particular candidate, but rather has the money going to a general purpose fund? That would be TV ads on political issues, right? Because issues are just issues, right? Issues are not candidates. Whereas, right, here we've got issues, that's good. Here we've got the incumbent senator. Well, a senator is an actual candidate, a mayoral candidate, and a senator's campaign, right? Those are all individuals. Soft money would not have gone to those individuals according to the information that you have in the passage. Okay? So that's how you use your inference skills to choose an appropriate example, which is something that GED Social Studies test might well ask you to do. Let's take a look at another question associated with this passage. Number 4. Which of the following is the most likely reason soft money was not a major election issue in the 1990s? Okay, so a couple of important phrases here. The most likely reason. So you're going to have to figure it out. Right? The passage isn't going to tell you, but based on what's in the passage, you have to think and reason this through. So soft money, we know soft money became an issue, right? But it says here that it was not a major election issue in the 1980s. Right? So take a little time to research. You can formulate some kind of idea about this before you go to the choices. You can also go to the choices and kind of research them and think about them one by one. So good luck, and come back when you're ready. Pause and come back when you're ready. All right. So in the passage, we've got this kind of timeline, right? We learned that in 1979, the original legislation was passed that allowed soft money. But that it wasn't until 1991 that the lawsuit forced disclosure. In other words, the lawsuit brought about the situation in which if you donated the money, you had to tell everyone about it, right? You couldn't do it in secret. So, why do we care? Because the question is about the 80s, right? And so the 80s were the decade in between when the original law was passed and when people became aware of all of those contributions that were being made. So during that time, it makes perfect sense that the reason why it wasn't an issue is that people didn't know about it, because disclosure wasn't required at that time. Disclosure was not required. So, this makes logical sense with the passage. But if you struggled over this and you had to, go through the answer choices and, think all of this through, let's see what you would have come across. B says political campaigns were publicly financed. Does the passage tell us anything about public financing? You can probably tell by the way I'm asking that question that the answer is no. Right? Public financing is outside the scope of this passage, and again, it may be something that you're aware of. The passage doesn't talk about it at all. It has no relevance. We don't know that. Answer choice C says most candidates spent part of their campaign funds on televised ads. Well, what the money was spent on wouldn't have anything to do with whether it was an issue or not. Right? Either the money's an issue or the money's not an issue. What it's being spent on isn't really relevant. And C is one of those interesting kind of distortion answer choices. McCain and Feingold, we know that's important, right? Because McCain and Feingold were the ones who finally brought about the law that did regulate this, right? After people were up in arms and they said, wait, what's going on? We're not sure we like this. And all the politicians said, don't worry, we'll take care of it. Then McCain and Feingold came on the scene. But they didn't come on the scene until after people, felt that this was an issue. This question is asking why it wasn't an issue, right? And if it wasn't an issue, then McCain and Feingold didn't have anything to do with it because they came much later in the story. Okay, so again, you can answer these inference questions directly, or you can answer them by eliminating 4 wrong choices. And when you do that, you want to make sure you know why an answer is incorrect. You have a solid reason. Alrighty, so now let's go ahead and take a look a little bit more closely at context. And there are a couple different ways that you're going to consider context in GED social studies passages. One is historical context, right? Well, what is historical context? It is anything that was happening at the point in history that something was created, right? So it lists here events, figures, or ideas that were prevalent. What were people thinking about? What were people talking about? And so, all right, that would be your historical context. Now, on the GED Social Studies test, you very often get a little phrase that tells you when you have one of these primary historical sources where it comes from. If you don't, you can usually figure it out from some kind of clues in the passage. If you read about President Lincoln, chances are that was a bit about in the middle of the 1800s and, around the time of the Civil War. Right? And so these are, again, the big picture, broad facts that you want to be aware of. But you don't have to be memorizing a lot of details. You just want to know enough to be able to say, okay, President Lincoln, Civil War, middle of the 1800s or the 19th century, as it is sometimes referred to. Okay, so that's historical context. And then the way that the author writes the passage also gives you context. So for instance, the author could simply be describing something, similar to the way that the Greek tragedy passage was really just a description of Greek tragedy. Occasionally a passage will introduce a problem and discuss one or more possible solutions to the problem. Could be chronological, telling a story, or listing things in order, which is essentially what we saw in that previous passage about soft money. Procedural is just telling you, or is describing steps that accomplish a task, as it says here, right? Not terribly common, but you could come across it. Compare and contrast. Now, in a compare and contrast passage, you really need to see points of comparison. So this is similar in these ways, this is different in these ways, and so that's something that you may see. And you probably recognize that a lot of what you have read in your practice, if you've done some social studies practice, a lot of it's descriptive, a lot of it's chronological, but you can see some of these other types of passages as well. And so, of course, the context of how the passage is written, the structure of the passage, tells you something about what the author is trying to communicate and what the author is trying to achieve by writing the passage. Finally, cause and effect. Now, this is important because history, things happen in history for a reason. Right? And so it's important to recognize that the cause and effect relationships can be very, very relevant. And they're actually so important that we'll come back and look at them a little bit more closely in a few minutes. But first, let's go ahead and take a look at this passage, which gives us some historical context, in that we're told that the excerpt is from a 1947 speech by President Harry Truman. And so 1947, okay, 1940s, mid-late 40s, you're thinking, oh, well, World War II just finished. And so that's going to be part of the context of this. And as you read, you'll see some details that are consistent with that. So take your time and read this, pause the video, come back when you're ready, and we'll do a little summary, as we always do. So President Truman says he's aware of the broad implications involved if the United States extends assistance to Greece and Turkey. Okay, right, so he's talking about the U.S. aiding these countries, so we know basically what the topic is of his speech. Now we have ... right, which means that he said some other stuff, and then we come back to his speech. And so let's take a look. One of the primary objectives of foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free from coercion. Okay, so basically they're thinking about giving aid to these countries, and we know that an important concept, an important principle is keeping nations free. And this word coercion is interesting, right? When you coerce someone, it's basically like you're bullying them or forcing them to do something. In the way that people are bullied and forced to do things in countries that have very restrictive regimes, right? Where the government is very involved and sort of dictatorial. So, okay. President Truman goes on to say this was a fundamental issue in the war with Germany and Japan. Though that would be that World War II that we knew was going to have some relevance to the passage. Okay, so let's go on and see what happens next. Our victory was won over countries which sought to impose their will and their way of life upon other nations. In other words, they were trying to force or coerce other nations to be like them. So go ahead and keep reading. You can pause here and come back when you're ready. We'll finish this passage up and take a look at the question. Now, this idea of nations being free from coercion is coming up again here, right? But then something new happens, something we haven't heard about yet. Still the idea of keeping nations free from coercion. The United States has taken a leading part in establishing the United Nations. Okay, so then a description of what the United Nations is what its goal is, right? And that is, again, the idea of freedom. Okay, so everyone's working together to keep everyone free. It's a very noble goal. That's the United Nations. That's what they're trying to do. So we understand that the U.S. had a big part in starting the United Nations, for lack of a better word, and that the United Nations, again, was trying to protect countries from other countries bullying them, right? To put it in simple terms. And it's a good idea to put it in simple terms, because then you take control of the passage and you're like, okay, I got this. So having summarized the passage, let's go ahead and take a look at question number 5. So based on this excerpt, why did the United States provide financial assistance? So be careful here. Be careful here when you do your research and when you carefully consider these answer choices and see how truly accurate each one is, because only one can be correct, as you know. So pause here, give this some thought, see what you come up with, and then we'll review. So when we research here, what we're going to see is that the foreign policy of the United States, right? One of the most important goals of the foreign policy of the United States is to keep other nations, ourselves and other nations, free from coercion, right? This was an idea, I think we heard about coercion 3 times in the passage, right? Okay. And then how did the United States go about trying to make sure that that happened? Well, the United States helped to form the United Nations. Now, once the United Nations is formed and everybody is working together to try to keep nations free, right? This is where we're at right now. Okay, here's the United States proposing to give money to Greece and Turkey. So what was the reason for that? Well, answer choice A says that it was to eliminate public protests. And again, I'm inclined to ask you, did the passage mention anywhere anything about public protests? Not here, and not here, right? So nowhere in this passage are public protests discussed. And what's important to note is that when you think about a restrictive regime, a country where people don't have as many rights and freedoms as they might have here, one of the first things that comes to mind is that sometimes people demonstrate against that. That's got nothing to do with this passage. That's something that's going on in my head. And that's something that tells me if it's going on in my head, but the passage doesn't mention it, that's not going to be correct. Let's keep going. To prevent government corruption. Now, be honest with you, this is a popular choice. Right? Students often want to pick this choice because we are looking to try to prevent governments from doing something. Definitely trying to prevent governments from doing something. But what is it that we're trying to prevent them from doing? We're trying to prevent them from coercing, right? We don't want them to be aggressive. We don't want them to be totalitarian, right? We don't want them to coerce people. Now, here's where you have to be really super careful. Coercion, which again is like bullying or forcing someone to do something, is totally different from corruption, right? Because corruption is essentially a situation in which somebody accepts some kind of favor and isn't really working in the interest of the people, but is working in the interest of somebody who has maybe paid that person off, right? And so that's that idea of corruption, being corrupt and not honest about the way that you serve your country, is not the same as being a bully. And so sometimes on the GED social studies test, you will see these examples in which an answer choice has a word or a phrase that sounds like or makes you associate with something from the passage, but it isn't actually the same thing. So watch out for that, because it's very tricky. B is incorrect. We're not talking about corruption. We're talking about coercion, and they are two very different things. C, to uphold international agreements. Okay, does this passage talk about an international agreement? Sure it does, because that would be the United Nations, right? A bunch of countries working together towards this goal of everyone being free from coercion. So indeed, if the United States is giving money to Greece and Turkey in order to try and prevent that from happening, in order to try and prevent those people from being coerced, to being subjected to a totalitarian regime, then they are going along with the United Nations, and the United Nations is an organization of international agreements. So answer choice C is absolutely correct, but maybe not what you thought you were looking for, right? So let's just see what else we have here and make sure that you understand why you would be able to say, oh, D is incorrect too. And this is another tricky one because it talks about foreign policy. Did the passage talk about foreign policy? Oh, yes, it did, right? Foreign policy is here in the first paragraph, the first full paragraph of President Truman's speech, right? One of the primary objectives of the foreign policy of the United States. Okay, so foreign policy is mentioned here, but only, in terms of, well, what is it that the United States wants to do with respect to these other countries? That's what foreign policy is, right? It's basically how you treat other countries, what you do for them, how you interact with them. That's foreign policy, right? And the only thing that the United States wants to do is help other countries from being bullied, not trying to influence their foreign policy. That again would be something different. And it's because you read about foreign policy in the passage. Answer choice D could be, oops, sorry about that, could be a little bit tempting. But no, the United States did not want to shape anyone else's foreign policy. That is not the reason for giving them aid, according to the passage. And again, whatever you may think about it isn't relevant. Inferences on the GED social studies test are not a matter of personal opinion. They're a matter of interpreting what's on the screen. Okay. Good work. Let's go ahead and see what's next. So, words and phrases in context. This is, again, you've got historical context, you've got context in terms of the purpose of the passage and how it is structured, and then you've got interpreting, very small pieces within a paragraph, within a sentence, within a paragraph, within the passage as a whole. And so in order to understand how these questions work, this is something that you may well see. What does this word mean in the passage? Reread the sentence that word was in. Think about what that word really means. What is it actually trying to say? Think of another way to express it, right? So when we say predict a synonym or a similar phrase, right? Think of another way to express it. And then look at the answer choices and see which choice is closest to that. But when you do that, though, beware, because typically when there's a word in context that you're being asked about by the test maker, it's often not being used in the most obvious way. Right? So whatever you obviously naturally think of when you see a particular word, if the GED test, social studies test asks you about it, chances are it means something other than that. Okay, so and again, notice that although you may well be tested on vocabulary, you're not tested on your knowledge of vocabulary. You are being tested on your ability to interpret the passage. so that you can understand what that word means in the context. You will always be given that context. So here's an example. It says, in the text of the First Amendment, what does establishment mean? So the word that you're interested in is in bold here. And our little introductory text here says that this is the First Amendment. Fine. And it's got that wordy, old-fashioned style of writing to it, which isn't so easy to get through. But let's go ahead and read it anyway, because that's what you got to do, right? It says, Congress shall make no law, so far so good, respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, that's a familiar phrase to all of us, or the right of people peaceably to assemble. Okay, right of assembly. Now, notice that the word establishment, which is what we care about, shows up here in this first, let us call it, clause, establishment. Now, what that means is that all this idea about abridging the freedom of speech or abridging the right of people to assemble, that's not really going to be giving us any context about the word establishment, so we don't actually need to worry about anything beyond this point right here. Right? So what we're interested in is this idea that, what this amendment is telling us is that Congress cannot pass a law respecting an establishment of religion. Now, respecting is an old-fashioned way of saying with respect to or in regard to, right? Okay, so they can't make a law about establishment of religion, or they can't make a law prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And again, a rather old-fashioned word that we tend not to use very much these days, but thereof just means, having to do with that other thing. Well, that would be religion. Religion is the thing that we're talking about here, right? So you can't tell people not to practice their religion. And what else can't? Well, Congress can't, right? Congress cannot tell people not to practice their religion. They can't prohibit the free exercise of their religion. And they also can't make any laws about the establishment of religion. So what does establishment mean in this context? And this is actually, and this amendment's interesting because what it says is, okay, they can't establish a state religion, and they can't prevent you from establishing your own religion, right? If you want to start your own religion tomorrow, you will be free to do so, right? Under this amendment, right? So in the context, what establishment actually means is just the kind of, like starting something up. That's a match for answer choice B, which is creation, right? Congress cannot keep you from creating a religion. Congress cannot create a religion and tell you that it has to be your religion, right? But usually when you think of establishment, you may be thinking of the establishment, in other words, the kind of accepted authority, the people who tell you what's what. That's the establishment, right? Or you may be thinking of, an establishment, like you might go to an establishment of higher learning, right? Which would be a fancy phrase for college, let's say, right? So an establishment, a location where a service is provided, that's an establishment, right? An accepted authority, right? A group of people who kind of get to have the final say on something, that's the establishment. But that's not what this word means in this context. And so that's what you care about here, and that's how you have to approach these questions. Really thinking first about what that really means, then going over here and finding that match. Okay, so words in context. Now let's go back, because I promised that we talk a little bit more about cause and effect. So let's go back to that kind of concept for a few minutes to wrap up this session. So, any event that happens may have a single cause or may have more than one cause. And because history is so complex, right? So much goes into the events that happen in history, and it's very uncommon, if it's like impossible, for a historical event to have just one cause. It just doesn't happen. So maybe I shouldn't say it just doesn't happen, but history is complicated. And so, all right, when an event happens in history, something caused it, or several things caused it. And you will definitely see passages on the GED Social Studies test that explain or describe some of that kind of cause and effect in history. And when you do, you're likely to see these kinds of words or phrases. Notice that we've referred to them as chronological or procedural, because again, they're telling you about how things happened over time or how something was accomplished. So, these kinds of words and phrases. So, as a result, because, therefore, you can see, in these words, if you think about how they're used, right, that they are telling you something about cause and effect. I did not eat breakfast this morning. Therefore, at noon, I was very hungry. Okay, I was hungry because I didn't eat breakfast. That was the cause of my hunger. Right? And, you're not going to see something quite that straightforward on the GED Social Studies test, but cause and effect will usually be, indicated in a way that's easy for you to recognize. Now, causation means that one thing definitely did cause the other. There are other kinds of relationships that you may see in GED Social Studies passages. One is coincidence, which I'm calling it a relationship, but it's actually not a relationship at all, right? Coincidence just means two things happened at the same time. Oh, what a coincidence, right? You run into your friend at the store you haven't seen in whatever, 10 years, because that literally happened to me a little while ago, right? Sometimes, right, there's no cause for that. There's no reason for that. It's just, oh, it happened. And hopefully it's a happy coincidence, right? So no necessary relationship between events that happen. I turned up at the supermarket, she turned up at the supermarket. Right? Correlation means that two things are happening at the same time and there is some kind of relationship that may be causal. So for instance, the more it rains, the more sales for umbrellas go up. Well, there's some likelihood that the umbrella sales are going up because it is raining, because people need to keep the rain off their heads and their shoulders and the rest of themselves, right? So, but we don't know necessarily that it is the rain that's causing the umbrella sales. Maybe umbrellas are on super sale. Maybe a $10 umbrella now costs $2 and everybody's rushing to the store to buy a $2 umbrella, right? So without proof of causality, you don't know that it's there. That said, GED Social Studies passages will sometimes tell you specifically that something caused something else. So let's take a look at this passage here. Again, take your time, pause the video, and come back when you're ready and think about how you would summarize this. You may actually want to, write some very brief notes on your note paper. So we have a passage here about immigration. And we're told that a large number of people immigrated. They have a really interesting statistic here. I think this is a fascinating statistic. That 7.5 million people arrived during this 50-year period, and it was more people than the entire U.S. population at the near the beginning of that period. Wow! So, so the population actually more than doubled, which is crazy over a period of 50 years. That seems crazy to me. That said, that is interesting to me, but it's important not for me and for you not to get too hung up on the details, no matter how interesting they are. So, okay, a lot of people immigrated to the United States. Almost all of them came from Northern Europe. Okay, so we have a kind of geographical reference here. And the majority were Catholic. Okay, that's another kind of demographic fact. Historians have often focused on what pushed these emigrants out of Europe. Right? An emigrant is someone who leaves their country of origin, let's say, and an immigrant is someone who comes to another country. So that's one person, but that person emigrated from their home country and immigrated to the United States. Fine. And so what you're going to notice here is this word on what pushed these immigrants out of Europe. Well, that's the same way as, I think it's another way of saying what caused them to leave. What caused them to leave. And so you can bet your bottom dollar that what you're about to read is what those historians thought. What did they think was the cause? Well, we had, for example, a crop failure, there was social upheaval, there was rapid industrialization, and that led to riots, civil unrest, and open rebellion. Okay, so that is a reason why people wanted to leave some of these countries in Northern Europe. Germany, they give us a specific example of Germany. So let's read on. We're going to get an example apparently about Ireland next. So what do we read about Ireland? Pause, come back when you're ready. So in Ireland, we had the potato famine. Right? So people were starving. There was nothing to eat. So they came to the United States, right? They left Ireland, came to the United States. So a couple of examples, Germany and Ireland. Notice that the author then says, while those crises spurred Europeans to emigrate, well, you know that the author's now going to tell us something a little different, right? Well, let's see. A variety of factors created a simultaneous pull to immigrate. So people were not only being pushed out by negative factors in their home countries, but perhaps pulled to the United States due to some kind of positive factors, right? So let's see what the historians say about that. People were describing the United States as a land of plenty, successful employment, plentiful land, and steamship companies. Here's just kind of an anecdotal example that's giving us a picture, right? Steamship companies offering passage across the Atlantic, right? So people could emigrate from Europe and immigrate to the United States, advertised with posters that showed majestic scenes of American abundance, right? There's lots of everything in America. That's why you'd want to come here. Okay? So this passage is all about cause and effect, right? What caused people to leave Europe? What caused people to come to the United States? Good. And so let's take a look at two questions. Which of the following was a cause of Northern European immigration during these decades in the passage? Now notice that there's a very specific reference to the 1840s and 1850s as there is in the passage. So take a look. You can pause your video, come back when you're ready. So we see that we have in the 1840s the German example, right? Riots, civil unrest, and open rebellion. And during the same years, we have Ireland having the famine. So those were two reasons. So let's go ahead and